As part of the Port Horizon project, we aim to provide short digital narratives to explain some of the background in relation to the 8 countries we're going to be examining. That's actually 7 countries and 1 region. The region is the Caribbean, and this short digital narrative is about the Caribbean. Now, in 1807, the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act abolished slavery in the British Empire. However, the actual Abolition Act didn't come into force until 27 years later in 1834. The reason for the delay was because the powerful plantocracy, the rich plantation owners, were arguing that they had lost their property and therefore should reasonably be compensated. And in 1834, the level of compensation was agreed. It was £20 million, which, according to a calculation, in 2013 would have been over £69 billion for the loss of their property, slaves. In fact, only slaves under 6 years old were freed. All other slaves had to serve a period of apprenticeship. That period of apprenticeship lasted, for the last of the slaves, until 1840. So, having taken over 30 years to implement the abolition of slavery, it wasn't abolished in the Caribbean until 1840. It still continued in India and Ceylon. And it wasn't until the enactment of the Indian Slavery Act in 1843, when the British government took over the British East India Company, that slavery across the empire was actually abolished. But even then, in 1838, indenture was introduced into some parts of India, but across the Caribbean, most notably Trinidad, and 500,000 Indians were taken to the Caribbean. 15% of those were Muslims, the majority being Hindu, 40% of which were untouchables, I should say. So, slaves for free, but they couldn't vote. Only a tiny minority-owned land, and the plantocracy acted to make sure that none of the others could buy fertile land, because they were starting their own growing businesses. But as plantations became uneconomical and the smaller plantations went bankrupt, housing lots were sold, and through that, chattel houses, which were made of wood and corrugated iron, were created in numbers that made them into small villages. The freed slaves didn't have job choices. If they stayed on the island, that meant working for the plantocracy, not only in the old jobs they had, but in worse conditions, because now they had no economic value to the plantocracy. 95% of the job of women on the island worked, black women, but they only worked for half the wage of the men. And because children under 6 weren't even apprentices, there was no health care and no education care, because the plantocracy had no reason to look after them. For men, the choices were different. Basically, the choice was to stay on the island and work for the plantocracy, or leave the island. And there were only 2 real ways to leave the island. One, Panama Canal. And 28,000 men died in the Panama Canal in an 8-year period. The other way, of course, was the Merchant Navy. And the Merchant Navy became a significant employer of Caribbean men. Now, when we reached the point of World War I, Caribbean men did not have to participate. They were part of the empire, but they couldn't be ordered to be involved either in the military or on the merchant navy. But they did so. And that was despite poverty. In 1910, a parliamentary inquiry found that 3 in 5 black people who were, as they said, distressed, that means were in poverty and were not eating properly, 3 out of 5 of them were seamen. Also, union racism. In 1911, Havelock Wilson, the leader of the Seamen's Union, won an argument in Parliament to make sure that the jobs on British ships went to white seamen first, in preference to black or Indian seamen. So only the dirty jobs, the worst jobs, usually below deck as firemen, went to black seamen. But despite that, Caribbean seamen and Caribbean soldiers went to war in World War One. But Havelock Wilson still returned to the topic of black seamen in 1925, despite the fact that many seamen had died in the war. And he persuaded Parliament to introduce, and this was after the creation of the Aliens Act, the Special Restriction Coloured Seamen's Order, which meant that all citizens of the British Empire who were not born in Britain had to register as aliens. So 70 years after slavery, with direct current experience of racism and intentional economic disadvantage by union and government, and the fact that the merchant navy companies who owned the ships paid them 20% less salary than a white seaman, despite this, Caribbean seamen chose to be involved in the First World War. Quite simply, they saw themselves as British, part of the British Empire. And as a consequence, thousands of them died as U-boats in particular sank their ships. For many, the issue was also one of family, because many of them had settled in Liverpool, Cardiff, Barry and London. People like Leonard Hines from Barbados, who settled in Barry in South Wales in 1903, and by the start of the First World War already had 6 children, all born in Wales, to his white wife who was born in Gatligear in the valleys. In 1919, after the First World War, or immediately after the First War, there were riots and violence directed against black people settled in Liverpool, Cardiff, London, Barry and in Newport. And this was generally fed by newspaper propaganda, bluntly lies and mistruths, and also fed by the fact that white soldiers returned from war to find there were no jobs. So they demanded that the jobs be given to them first, and the consequence of that was that black people found themselves in poverty. And the Liverpool Echo, for example, stated there were hundreds of Brazilian Negroes in Barry. In actual fact, the census shows that in 1911 there were 5 Brazilians who were all seamen. None of them were married, none of them had families. Most of the minority population of Barry were Caribbean, Somalia, Greece and in Italy. Despite the racism between the wars, men from the Caribbean continued to settle in Britain, and they went to war in 1939. The answer to the why is very simple. They saw themselves and their British-born children, who were the natural consequence of their relationship and marriage to British women, they saw themselves as part of the British Empire and therefore British.